Salt by Toby Bennett. Moonlight shimmered over the undulating surface of the desert, and just for a moment Tiberius could imagine the waters that had left their echo in the pale dust. That primeval ocean was long since lost to human eyes. It had retreated from Phoebus's glare, leaving behind only a thick crust of salt and sculpted sand. Not all trace had evaporated. Anyone unlucky enough to break that parched layer was sure to unleash the stench of age-old putrefaction. Beneath the crust lay a clinging, briny mud, composed of the rotting forms of all that had once swum or squirmed in the great ocean beneath his feet. The ancient humus had mixed and mulched in the darkness, with only shells and strange bones to mark that its constituents had ever crawled up from the filth to which they had returned. Tiberius shook his head to banish the moonlight vision. No good could come of imagining what might once have glided over the cracked surface on which he stood. He was no great follower of the imperial religion, but Tiberius dragged the thick thumb of his free hand back and forth across his mailed chest. What slimy survivors of the desert's great desiccation might have been waiting beneath the carpenter's feet when he strode the Lake of Galilee? He forced himself to relax, and was rewarded with a thin stream from his half-empty bladder. His eyes rolled up to the blazing stars, then back to the parched earth he was pissing on. What could bring men here through the searing gauntlet of the desert? Salt, that's what his employer would say, but Tiberius wasn't sure he trusted the young Arab. A poet, they said, but who would be foolish enough to believe that a mere poet would be able to finance such an expedition? Tiberius smiled at the thought. A drunk mercenary in a bar just outside Damascus, for one. It hadn't sounded so bad when the drink was on him. Easy, really. Tiberius favoured his great-grandfather, who had been one of the northern giants the empire eagerly welcomed into their armies to help defend their shrinking borders. His sheer physical presence was enough to put up the shriveled tribesmen and skinny Syrian wretches that made up the bulk of the expedition. No one would be fool enough to provoke him, and guarding women had sounded like easy money. If Tiberius were a more honest man, he might also have admitted that he had lost any taste for the butchery that had made up the bulk of his career so far. He'd reasoned that there was little chance of bloodletting on the sham of an expedition, and imagined he wouldn't have to work too long before he got paid. The poet might have a surfeit of ambition, but as was to be expected of his ilk, he had little grasp of the practicalities. Who would go on an extended expedition and burden themselves with concubines after all? Salt mining was dangerous, dirty work. Tiberius had expected the poet to get bored quickly and return to more civilized climes once whatever hopes he had proved false. Things had not turned out that way. They were weeks out from the last villages now, and a kind of panic was settling on the large mercenary's mind. The cantankerous camel that he had once so resented now seemed like his only lifeline. A part of him knew that he had gone past the point where he could reliably head back on his own, and despite the parched expanse around him, he felt a burgeoning claustrophobia. The ocean might be gone, but men drowned in this sea of sand every day. Maria's tits! He stepped back quickly, avoiding the errant drops of his own urine, and shook himself. There was a dim guilt at having profaned the Holy Mother. He'd hedge his bets by slipping a coin to the priests when he found himself somewhere civilized. It was a beginner's mistake. Any veteran knew it didn't do to get distracted while relieving yourself when desert winds could shift so quickly. Tiberius glanced around. One more sign that he had to work on keeping his thoughts from straying too far. Bad enough he was becoming unnerved. The last thing he wanted was to stand watch with piss in his sandals. The stars shone down, cold and impassive, perhaps cruel. Tiberius fought to master his errant thoughts. There was no reason for apprehension. The monsters he'd imagined were long gone, and what did stars care if he stained his sandals? The worst aspect of the human comedy was that in all likelihood no one was watching. There'd certainly be no gods or devils to answer the wailing of the last man he'd gutted. Not even a man, just a boy playing at soldiers. No doubt his mother's screams would have split the skies had she been there to see her child fall. But heaven itself went on regardless. The sun still shone, the earth was fed, and all that seemed certain was the indifference of the wide stage on which the tiny tragedy had played out. The big mercenary shivered, and it wasn't the night that chilled him this time. Like all who dealt in death, he'd seen enough to know that the god of the black-robed priests in Byzantium cared little what transpired on his earth. The shepherd only seemed to sort his flock once they were slaughtered. Something for a soldier to bear in mind, but nothing to worry about above ground. The wind changed again as the desert took another breath. He glared out into the infinite blackness, and the old dark thoughts came as they always did, whenever he was sober and alone at night. A good soldier knew better than to ask big questions, but sometimes you just had to speculate. Once the earth took a man back, who knew where he might end up? He set his teeth and forced himself not to think about the things for which he might answer when he met his own end. The trouble was that unlike the reckless boys he killed, Tiberius had lived long enough to recognize the nihilism that he'd once called courage for what it was. It was no wonder there were ghosts out here in the night with him. The vacuum of the desert demanded to be filled by the things most compressed in a man's soul. He had to remember that they were not real. In a few hours the sun would rise and reveal only the emptiness of the desert. But in that moment he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that even the stars were laughing at him. Too many Greek philosophers in your ancestry, he chided himself. Not true. His line boasted several Greeks, but none noted for their philosophy. The mercenary couldn't admit to himself that at that moment he needed to hear his own voice in the silence. The stars were strange and a little too bright. The real reason he felt uneasy was the momentary glimpse of the lost ocean he had seen by their pallid light. Though the vision had abated, he could still smell it, the antique salt and the stench beneath, the rot of an extinction that predated any biblical flood. The ghost of his past and the eerie emptiness in which he stood were strange enough, but long watches also gave you a certain clarity, and too much time to turn things over in your mind. Tiberius had a growing belief that salt was the least of Hazred's concerns, whatever the little Arab might claim. The first clue to the man's real nature was his women. They were pretty enough to be the harlots Tiberius had imagined when he'd been offered the job. Tiberius had no problem discerning pleasing curves beneath their robes, and full lips behind their translucent veils. But there was something off about them, nothing that he could put his finger on at first, but his sense of unease about them had grown with every day he stood guard on their oversized litters. After weeks of service, the prospect of going near those strange women made his skin crawl. Tiberius had considered himself a man of the world before he'd embarked on the expedition. He could understand that a young man with some money to throw about might bring some entertainment for the road, but he'd quickly realized Hazred didn't visit his harem for any conventional purpose. The screaming was muffled and didn't carry, even in the silence of the desert. But over the long cold nights Tiberius had come to understand that his true function was not to protect the woman's virtue, but to keep them penned for their master. If truth were told, he was only out in the desert now with his dick in his hand, because it felt more comfortable to urinate when he didn't really need to, than to have to endure the stifled sounds of pain coming from the tent, or the wafts of heavy cloying incense that coiled from beneath the tent flaps. Even the torture wasn't the problem. He didn't like it, but it was none of his business if the poet used his women poorly. He'd been paid enough to ensure that. It was the changes he'd noted in the women that caused his stomach to knot and bladder to clench. The mercenary had taken his life into his hands many times before, but there were moments where it seemed to him that whatever was transpiring within the tents represented a threat more real than any death he might find at the tip of a sword. When the furtive rituals reached their height, the women would change. One moment they would scream in fear as if all the devils of Tartarus were tearing at them, and the next they would talk in sultry voices, welcoming whatever pain the poet inflicted upon them, and even soliciting him to greater excess. Tiberius would have expected terror, even resignation as the poet's victims surrendered to their fate. He could have become acclimatized to either, but it seemed to him that their strangeness only grew, and in the worst moments he had no doubt that he had become caught up in something unnatural. Perhaps some of their strangeness could be ascribed to the many smokes and liquors the poet insisted the women ingest during the day. When the sun shone, Tiberius could almost convince himself that it was only the drugs talking. Then the night would come again, and the wanton voices echoed through the dark. When he heard their yowling, Tiberius was hard-pressed to keep his post. The crawling sense of some impending doom made the emptiness of the desert seem preferable to what he might see by the light of flickering torches. For the past week there had been no respite. Even when the sun was at its highest, the women babbled through the bright covering of the cages in which they travelled. Their noises, whispers and hissing for the most part, were muffled by the heavy fabrics and hides. What he did hear was bad enough. They spoke in some strange dialect he could barely understand, but even a few syllables set his nerves rattling. He thanked every god he could name that he had no real understanding of what the mad sluts said. Tiberius was of the opinion that he and his fellow guard, Stephanus, had been hired specifically because they couldn't understand the woman's jabbering. The poet clearly did. He often rode close to scribble down their words in his flowing script. Unlike Stephanus, Tiberius had been around. He'd taken coin to be part of the force that put old golden-nosed Justinian back on the throne in Constantinople, and he'd marched with the emperor when he turned on his old ally, Khan Tervel. The Khan had bloodied what was left of the emperor's nose, and Tiberius had been along for the ride. Tiberius had killed and seen a thing or two. He didn't need to share a language to know that the women in the harem were becoming crazier by the day. Tiberius shivered. It seemed to be catching. When he came to the conclusion that Jove himself would have had trouble sustaining a flow, the mercenary refastened his breeches and turned back to his post. In that instant a shadow hurtled from the campsite and thudded into him. A lesser man would have been thrown back by the impact, but the big mercenary only grunted and instinctively grasped at whatever had hit him. The lights from the camp had robbed his eyes of some of the sensitivity they had built up looking out into the desert. It was the pungent odor of incense and the whisper of silk that first told him he wasn't dealing with some desert predator. Tiberius hardened his grip and blinked. The woman in his arms looked back with wild eyes that seemed almost luminescent in the darkness. Her dusky skin made a crescent moon of her perfect white teeth. Then, before he knew what was happening, she bit him. The mercenary was seasoned enough to rise above the pain, and his grip remained strong. "You little bitch!" he bellowed, and tore her head back by grabbing her thick, dark hair with his other hand. He held her out at arm's length, where she twitched and thrashed like a fish on the hook, but she wasn't going anywhere. It was too dark to see much, but Tiberius could already feel the familiar sensation of blood cooling on his injured hand. Laughter bubbled from the mad woman's wet lips and only intensified when he shook her by the hair. "Stop that, you mad strumpet!" Tiberius snarled, unnerved by the insane giggling. "Ethka danos katu fatang." The girl spat out the strange words, then fell silent when a cry came from the direction of the tents. "Tiberius, my friend, do you have her?" The poet was holding a dark robe tightly about himself, and his hair was wild. Tiberius's employer looked 1,000 miles from the refined youth who had hired him back in Damascus. At the sound of her master's voice, the woman slumped and went still. Tiberius had to strain to hold her upright. "I've got her all right, and I got my hand bitten for my troubles." He wanted to add, "and what the hell is going on here?" but he knew better. "My regrets that you have suffered injury, but know that you have served me well. I'll make sure the silver I promised you isn't light, eh?" The young man smiled, his teeth just as white as the girl's. "As you say, sir, just doing my duty. And if the silly little whore had been luckier, she wouldn't have run straight into me," he thought. At that moment it didn't seem to matter that all that awaited her was a burning death in the desert. One look at the poet's wild eyes, and Tiberius thought he might have done the same in her position. "Good man!" Hazred raised his hand and motioned for the mercenary to come closer. "I'd be grateful if you would extend your duty and bring her back. Stephanus, give him a bit of help if he's hurt his hand, and be quick about it. Here you are dozing while your friend does your job for you." "Sir," the younger mercenary kept his eyes down and looked appropriately shamefaced. "Apologies." "Not at all, Stephanus." The poet pulled his robe tighter. "Take it as a lesson. These girls can be quick as striking serpents, so be wary in the future. For now, though, you go and get her back for me so I can get out of this cold night air." The younger mercenary advanced. The woman shuddered. Her lambent eyes rolled back to regard Hazred, and Tiberius wasn't sure if the girl was quivering with terror or desire. Perhaps both. His hand was beginning to throb. He took a step forward, dragging her back to the camp with his good hand. She resisted for a second, then went limp, apparently submitting to his greater strength. Before he knew what was happening, she had reversed her direction and coiled sinuously around him. "Please," she said in Greek, and looked up at him with those glowing eyes. Tiberius felt his hand loosen, and he could sense her gathering herself to spring away. But by then Stephanus had reached them. Stephanus was quick and far from gentle when he relieved Tiberius of the woman, and the mercenary was soon left nursing his aching hand on his own. The blood had begun to dry by the time he got back into the torchlight of the camp. "I'm going to get this sorted." He held up the blood-stained hand. Stephanus nodded but said nothing. Tiberius knew what Stephanus was thinking. If he hadn't gone off for so long, the girl might never have escaped, and Stephanus might not have looked the fool. Tiberius shrugged off the silent accusation and made his way over to his saddlebags. He held his aching hand up to stop any further bleeding, and rummaged through his possessions with his uninjured hand until he found the strips of cloth he used for bandages. He used a few drops of water to clear the drying blood from his hand, and finally examined his wound. With the blood cleaned away, it was clear the girl had bitten hard. The skin was raised, and there was no doubt in his mind that the area would be bruised by morning. But try as he might, he could find only 2 tiny tears in his leathery skin. The blood that had so copiously covered his hand and clothing could not have been his own. The sun was high, and the air came in cloying waves that burned the lung. The expedition had been making for a stand of weathered rocks all morning. By the time they reached their destination, there was little relief to be found near the stones. With the sun at its zenith, shadows were at their shortest, and there was nothing for the unfortunate explorers to do but hide beneath the fabrics and skins they had brought with them and wait out the heat. Tiberius had been forced to remove his chainmail. He had also unlaced the rust-stained tunic beneath almost to his navel. Neither the removal of clothing nor the tepid liquid in his water skin offered any respite. The oversized mercenary just sat panting like a wounded animal, his mind churning over the events of the night before. The blood had made him look at things more closely. The pale strips of leather that bound the poet's book, the dark ink. Hazred was sitting in the shade of the woman's litter, calmly transcribing whatever the drugged captives whispered to him. Stephanus was close by, sharing the same shadows. If he had noticed the blood on the woman when he brought her into the light, then he hadn't mentioned it. Tiberius didn't know how his fellow mercenary could stand the sound of those sibilant whispers. For his own part, Tiberius had made a great show of needing to sleep without such interruptions, and had retreated to the lesser shade of his cloak. He watched the camp through hooded eyes, noting that the diggers and litter-bearers also gave the bright litter where the poet sat a wide berth. Was it possible that the simple savages had realized there was something wrong even before he had? The mercenary touched his sword hilt for comfort. Best not to let the knowledge of the poet's true nature upset him. The silver would still spend once they got back to civilization, and he was no harem whore to be bled for ink. "Let it go," he warned himself. "You can't afford to fuck up here." He took another superheated breath and looked up at the outline of the sun glistening through the fabric of his cloak. If the stars had seemed cruel, Phoebus seemed positively murderous today. He rubbed his aching head, and his hand came away slick with water he could not afford to lose. How much longer could the mad Arab keep them out here? How much longer before the whole expedition tore apart? Now that he shared their sentiments, the growing dissatisfaction was clear to read on every Syrian face. The question became whether he would fight with or against the poet when the time came. Hazred was seemingly oblivious to all this, and he kept at his writing until the fire in the sky began to ebb. Then, when only embers remained on the horizon, he rose and went to examine the salt-encrusted stones that hid them from the sun god's retreating chariot. Tiberius found himself rising and following the young loon down a slope to the sides of the great rock. As scared as he was to confront the poet, someone had to say something before the camp erupted into violence, and he became trapped out in the desert. "You're curious?" the poet asked as the mercenary joined him at the wall of stone. "Only about how much longer you intend to push on into this hellhole," Tiberius replied. "Perhaps you have less experience with men than I. Take it from me, these wretches are on the point of breaking." Hazred smiled amiably. "I thought you might be about to mention the girl." "He's toying with me," Tiberius thought, "and he's not concerned about the mood of the company at all. Why?" "None of my business," Tiberius answered, matching Hazred's indifference. "Indeed, yet you think about her, do you not? About what I might have done to her?" The man was clearly baiting him. "I never said that," the mercenary answered evenly. "No need for you to say anything, my friend. You see, Tiberius, I know men, and women for that matter, all too well. I wouldn't be much of a poet unless I was first a student of human nature. Then why do you push them so hard? They'll not take much more. Tiberius was speaking for his own dwindling patience at least as much as the rest of the men's. I push them because after tonight it will not matter. The Arab's eyes glittered in the gloom of the old rock's shadow. Ice flowed through Tiberius's soul. The Arab couldn't mean that the way it sounded. Is this the place, then? Is the salt here? Tiberius asked, trying to interpret the last statement less ominously. Yes and no, came the reply. We have come to the end of our search. Those wretches, as you call them, will have no need to dig for salt. They have carried it with them all along. What? I have no gift for metaphor, Hazred. If we didn't come here to mine salt as you said, what is this all about? For answer the poet reached out and rubbed a hand against the rock. The pale residue that had covered the surface for untold centuries crumbled to reveal deep channels carved into the dark stone beneath. You should feel privileged to have seen these marks. Hazred raised his hand to brush along the weathered wall. More twisted interlocking lines were revealed, like writhing serpents or eels. Tiberius found his head swimming at the sight of the script, which was both angular and somehow sinuous at the same time. It was painful to look at the chaotic pattern, and he began to feel as sick as he had on the boat that first brought him to the Holy Land. They have not been seen since the flood, the poet said, his voice full of wonder. Not since this place was still a living ocean. How could that be so? No men could have made these marks when this land was flooded. No men did. A woman's scream echoed in the desert air behind them, only to be taken up by the parched throats of the workers. There are some that remember it nonetheless. The poet talked as if he had not heard the scream, or as if it were of no consequence. What was that? Tiberius whirled round and jogged back to the low bank of sand behind them. He guessed he wouldn't like what he saw when he got high enough, but he had to go. He felt the poet's dark eyes on his back, but he knew Hazred would not hurry himself. Tiberius could tell the Arab was not surprised at all. When he reached the top of the rise, he could see the great litter which bore the women was open. Stephanus stood in the entryway, grasping at his throat. Even in the seconds that he stood poised there, the shadows from the rock seemed to snake over his face, and the sun plunged lower, bringing a ruddy gloom to the scene. In answer, blood sprang from between Stephanus's fingers, and the mercenary toppled forward. "They've slit his throat!" Tiberius yelled. "What was the fool doing in there?" "I told him to bring them to me," Hazred said calmly from behind him. "I did want him to wait until it was a bit darker, though. They are not fond of the sun." "Not fond of the—" Tiberius half turned to inquire what the poet meant by that comment, then caught a flash of movement. The women were coming out of the litter. Tiberius gasped to see them. Each of the dusky beauties was completely naked, and the mercenary had never seen finer flesh on display, nor felt so intimidated despite all his experience of battle. They poured out, dark and wild, stepping over the fallen body of Stephanus. Tiberius was so overwhelmed by the sight that it took him a moment to realize their naked bodies were wreathed in strange hieroglyphics that twisted and caught the dying light with each movement of their perfect limbs. The runes were angular, yet somehow flowing, interlocking then breaking apart in a way that hurt to even look at. All picked out in livid scars, fresh and raised. Tiberius glanced back to the alien patterns carved into the stones behind them, and knew that the same unnerving shapes could be found under the pallid casing of salt that hid whatever truly stood under the stones. Another scream pulled him back to the scene in the camp. This time it was a man's. One of the women had claimed a second victim with the swift sweep of a curved dagger. Her aim was every bit as deadly as it had been in Stephanus's case, and the litter-bearer collapsed in a shower of gore. The man's killer immediately kneeled and began sucking at the long wound in his throat. All across the camp, men were slowly becoming aware of the deadly creatures in their midst, but none of them were ready for the ravenous ferocity of their raven-haired attackers. The women's strength was as inhuman as their appearance, and they cut a swathe through the fleeing men that would have done a squad of imperial soldiers proud. Tiberius's hand fell to his sword, but he was uncertain whether to run to the aid of his fellow men or strike down the man who had brought them to this place and set the she-wolves upon them. Hazred placed his soft hand over the mercenary's whitened knuckles. "Do not fear, Tiberius. You will not be part of the slaughter. Not unless you insist on it. La Massu has claimed you for her own." Tiberius felt no relief at the promise. The poet's thumb caressed the tender flesh where he had been bitten. What poison had the mad woman injected into him to make him shake so? to make it seem that he couldn't draw his sword on the madman next to him, even if he wanted to. It only took moments for the slaughter of nearly 100 men, and when the 9 women had finished their work, they began to bring the bodies to the stones, like so many calves to be offered on the ancient altar. What blood they didn't claim for themselves they smeared over the runes as they cleared away the thick white crystals to reveal a lintel, then a gaping doorway of impossible size, opening onto salt-encrusted steps that only a giant might use with any comfort. Yes, the poet whispered, the salt of their blood returned at last to the source of all. The father of salt has slept ages of men, waiting for his time to come again, for the ocean to return. The moon was rising by the time the doorway was cleared, and in all that time Tiberius had remained as still as Lot's wife, frozen in the salt of the desert. Now the silver light brought back the sea, and Tiberius could almost see the strange shapes of marine monsters squirming above him, floating on a tide of starlight that blazed down from an unforgiving sky. The portal before him was ghostly in the darkness, and the pale walls gave hints of the dark engravings beneath. Twisted shapes and fell monsters that had once oozed in the Stygian depths. Even these grotesques were not the strangest creatures depicted. They were figures, not quite men, cavorting with the alien monstrosities. Tiberius recognized these as the self-portraits of those who had carved this rock while the water was yet wild and frothing, far above the cursed gate. At last the women finished their work and came to kneel before the mercenary and the poet. Close up, the agonizing carvings in their skins set Tiberius's teeth chattering, and he had to focus not to lose control of himself entirely. "Do not worry, my friend. I too am lost for words," Hazred confided, grasping his shoulder. "Come, you will join us and see what has not been seen since the first oceans cooled, and will not be seen again till they swallow the world." Even then Tiberius would have refused, dared the merciless desert rather than enter that gaping darkness. But the woman nearest him looked up, and his will crumbled before what he saw in those serpent-yellow eyes. The woman chuckled wetly through her mask of blood, and spoke in her alien tongue. "She knew you would not refuse. You have pleased her," Hazred interpreted. Try as he might, Tiberius couldn't feel anger at that, only joy that the woman was pleased. He rubbed his aching hand. What had they done to him? The women fetched lanterns and formed a procession on either side of the 2 men. They neared the ancient gate, and a blast like the breath of a titan greeted them, hot and spiced in the chill desert air. The stairs ahead of them were too deep to even consider using safely, so the women led them on the narrow strip of stone that formed a ramp next to the steps. The thin ledge forced them to walk single file, and the residue on the steep incline made progress dangerous, to say the least. The party clutched to the carved walls for handholds as they descended, and Tiberius would have sworn that the powdery surface writhed beneath his desperate fingers. Mind-bending shapes leered and loomed out of the twilight, each one making him want to close his eyes, or even gouge them out so that he might never have to see such things again. There was no escape for him, though. Each time he slowed or mewled in terror, the woman Lamashu would place a hand on his shoulder and push him forward. Even at the brink of madness, he could not refuse her. Tiberius would not have been surprised to learn that the sun rose and fell in the world outside before they reached the bottom of that nightmarish passage, and a pale luminescence began to tinge the edge of the lamplight. The lambent glow intensified as they moved towards the white-crusted towers of some archaic city, which squatted in the vast cavern they had entered. Towers of impossible dimensions groaned beneath the weight of eons and the pressures of dry air. When it had first been carved, the city had abided in the darkest depths beneath the protection of the waves. What yet remained could only exist in the troubled dreams of a madman. Tiberius felt that one movement, even a gust, might bring the whole mess crumbling down. Yet it stood, mocking heaven and Hades with its existence. At length they came to the outskirts of the white city, and stood below its crumbling towers. Now that they were close, Tiberius could see that there were no entrances at ground level. Those who had built the quasi-organic structures would no doubt have swum up to their front doors. The stench of the place was beyond endurance. The mud of the desert above was muted by comparison. The power, the purity of what he smelled overloaded his senses in seconds. Salt! It was salt, but stronger and more pungent than he had ever experienced before. The buildings were coated with it, the ground was awash with it, and each crunching footfall broke open the powdery crust, releasing tiny white clouds into the air. As they approached the center of the Cyclopean city, Tiberius could see that the light illuminating this single point, in what could only be Plato's great cave, sprung from a massive pool of liquid made chalky white with salt. When they reached the edge of the pool, he saw that strange colours. Tiberius did not believe the purple and silver flashes had more substance than the eerie light of which they were composed, cavorted and spun in the depths of the pool. At the centre of the last remnants of the long-gone sea there sat a mountain, or rather a slumped shape that might be mistaken for a mountain, if you are unable to make out the webbed toes or scaled shins. Tiberius breathed thanks to all the gods he'd ever heard tell of that neither the pool's ambience nor the harsher lamplight reached the face of that slumbering giant, for he felt that one glance at whatever was slumped above him might make him lose the last vestiges of reason that he had managed to cling to thus far. Next to him the poet began to laugh, and the 9 women took up his manic giggling. "If you could see your face, Tiberius," the poet said at last, "does it come as such a blow to lose those preconceptions that have blinded you for so long? Is this why the infant cries when first exposed to the light?" Again Tiberius gave no answer. He had no answer. Instead he stood slack-jawed, his knees locked against the shivers that threatened to rob him of the power to stand. The bloody battles of his younger days had not so unmanned him as the ill-lit thing that squatted before him and the pool of churning colours at his feet. As he stood, trying to regain control of himself, the 9 women approached the glowing pool. They chattered to each other in their harsh, jarring gibberish. A part of Tiberius's mind could almost believe they were women laughing and talking to each other on their way to collect water from a river. He wanted to believe that, to convince himself that he had never left the bar in Damascus, and that the sloshing sound of the waters on the shore of the pool really came from the Abana River. It was preferable to believe himself mad than face the fact that the universe could cough up such vileness. The woman who had bitten him turned towards him and gave a final smile. Her teeth were still white in the black smear of dried blood that covered the lower half of her face. The women placed their lanterns on the caustic banks, and then, with all the poise that Cleopatra must have shown when anointing herself in her own milky bath, the women slipped into the pool. The reaction of the water was anything but placid. Within seconds the stench of rotten, burning flesh mixed with the waft of salt. The runes carved into the women's bodies blazed. Blood erupted from the deep furrows only to be purged by the all-consuming salt. Blood boiled, flesh parted, and bone melted away, leaving only 9 new colours that flashed brightly before plunging into the heart of the pool. From far above there came a sound like a crow screaming over thunder as the slumbering Titan murmured his approval. They had been gone a long time. I promised to bring them home, the poet commented, looking at the places where the women had disappeared, then up to the shrouded grotesque. Not all his children could reach him when the oceans began to recede. If you weep for those that carried them, know that they could not have served a higher function. Hazred examined his remaining companion for a moment. You would weep for whores and mad women? Shells, my friend, cages of flesh. I chose no one of worth. One I found drooling in her own filth. Her family sold her for copper. Or are you simply overwhelmed by everything else? I cannot see why Lamatsu chose you if you are so weak of mind and purpose. What is that thing? Tiberius asked when he could find his voice. One who sleeps and dreams? The poet crossed closer and removed a goblet from his robe. What dreams to lead him beyond the stars? Hazrak dipped the goblet into the liquid, careful not to let it touch his hand, then looked towards the desiccated Titan. Do you think these are his tears for what he sees? He frowned at Tiberius's lack of response. Do you not even wonder? The poet took a single sip, then fell to his knees, gagging and knocking the cup into the viscous pool. What it must be to be mortal and love your ignorance! Your kind skulk like insects hiding from the light. I am not one of you! The poet's ragged voice found strength as he went on. This salt that your empire paid its soldiers in, and you also covet, it is part of life itself. Since the first oceans wrapped themselves around this globe, he has mingled with us. Yet now you will not even look up to see the face of the delirium from which you are formed. The poet's body shuddered, and he bent low again. To Tiberius's horror, his hair was fading before his eyes, going pure white from root to tip. The poet groaned, then stood up again, flashing a toothless smile of swollen red gums. "All things have their price," he crooned. "You ask yourself why I would seek this? There are no easy answers, but you may soon understand if the demon's bite takes." The mad Arab's eyes were like two watery boiled eggs without pupils or even the redness of veins to spoil the perfect alabaster surface. Tiberius tore his gaze away from the pool and the thing beyond it. The woman who had entranced and led him here was gone, and all that was left was the shrunken poet, his hand locked on his sword hilt. He didn't know if he would be able to find his way back to the desert above. He doubted the lanterns would last much longer. Even if he made it out, the desert would have him. That was all but certain. One thing he could have was revenge on the madman who had brought him here. The blade was in his hand before the hiss of steel reached the desiccated poet's ears. "Enough of your ranting," Tiberius growled. "I'll have no part of your madness." "You'll drink if you have any sense," Hazred said calmly. "You do not know the hunger that will follow Lamatsu's bite." The poet closed his eyes as if seeing another place and time. "You have no idea what it is to seek the salt in another's blood, to feed such need. Only here can your hunger be sated forever." Hazred stopped and looked about him with his milky, unseeing eyes. "I am afraid the cup is lost to us, but your hand might last long enough to bring a few drops to your lips. Take my word, as the years pass you will find the loss of a hand a fair price for such ease." "Your word!" Tiberius bellowed. "Your word, and you think I will touch that filth?" The mercenary stepped forward and plunged his sword through the Arab to the hilt. The blade protruded from Hazred's back for a few seconds as they stood there in a frozen clinch. Then, to Tiberius's horror, he heard the sound of metal hitting the ground. Half a sword blade lay smoking on the sand behind the poet, and when Tiberius stepped back, he found himself holding a hilt with only the stub of a blade remaining. "Still you cling to your ignorance," Hazred said amiably. "Like so many others, there is no blade made to harm this flesh, nor will any grave enfold this shell, for this world has no claim on me now. Only my Lord will gather me in at the last tide. I shall await the passing of stars, dreaming even as he does, through eons yet unimagined. It may take a lifetime, many even, but you will one day see with eyes such as mine." The white orbs blazed. "Here, you savage!" Hazred thrust a hand into his robes again and brought forth the volume that he had written in for as long as Tiberius had known him. The Arab flicked his wrist, and the heavy book landed at Tiberius's feet. The mercenary already knew the source of at least some of the volume's ink, but in the pale light the flattened nipples that adorned the leather cover were unmistakable. "Learn to read, add to it if you like, that others might share this journey and come to truth. In your own time you can pay the price for what I offered freely." Tiberius hesitated, caught between the poet's command and the urge to flee. "Pick it up." The white eyes swelled. Tiberius could not have said why he touched the leather-bound abomination. His skin crawled even as he took the dead weight of the thing in his hand. The pale leather was still warm from its place close to the poet's heart. It felt almost alive in his hand. But Tiberius found he could not let the book fall, despite his revulsion. Instead, he wiped the white residue from it and kept it safe as he made his way out of the infinite darkness of the cave and back to the light. The desert did not claim him, for even the indifferent sands could not enfold his corruption. He returned to the cities of men, but he was not a man any longer. Years passed, more than he had any right to, and the light of the world beneath the naked sky seemed harsher as his hunger grew. His old eyes were blinded by the sun, and even star and moon were bright. He had ears now to detect the mocking laughter of the distant stars and hear spirits howl upon the wind. Slowly forced beyond the common spaces where men and women writhed and cowered in their willing ignorance, Tiberius came at last to the mad Arab's truth. He learned to read the book by candlelight. The sun had become too cruel, and he learned the names of many things that once swam and still swim the sea of dwarfs, giants, nebulas, and quasars. He learned the secret of the salt that had nurtured the first life and preserved it even in death. Once the ocean had held all the world in savage accord, in tides of flashing light and living color. Blood fed blood, and strange altars were raised to stranger gods, that lapped the red tides from the foamy waves. He learned their names and mysteries, the ways to bind them into flesh and make them offer up their secrets. The demon's bite had given him the hunger that drove him, and the book imparted the knowledge that guided him through uncounted dreamless days and into nights of carnal abandon. Eventually salt, dead white and pumping red, was all that held his attention. It was a sacrifice, a savage communion that brought memories of ages past and spun him through lost vistas of time that he could feel in the pounding of his ageless heart and the tides of his altered body. It was a sensation that few knew, the echo of a ghastly dream that most would rot without knowing, yet shared each night. It was a torture made more exquisite by his own imperviousness, for his body became as pale and unyielding as the marble from which a boy from Caprice would carve a sainted mother and her murdered child. Like that exquisite stone, he must wait, hollow and hungry, until the stars were right, till the waters rose again.